It's a great question today that we ponder, was it worth it? There's a couple of things to remember about air power before we begin in earnest. One is that there was an enormous transformation between its inaugural appearance in 1914 in World War I, when pilots in biplanes shot revolvers at each other. In less than 30 years, about 25 years, 24 years, at the outbreak in September 1st of 1939 in World War II, we had monoplanes and the speeds had increased from 100 miles an hour to nearly 300, and people were firing about 700 to 800 shots per minute on machine guns, sometimes right through the propeller, sometimes on the wings. And they were carrying bomb loads, in the case of fighter bombers, of 500 to 1,000 pounds, and bombers even far greater. So there was a miraculous transformation in the role of air power. And that created our architects of air power, so to speak, in the European countries and in the United States as well. Billy Mitchell, Duet, Weaver in Germany. And they were so enthralled by this new weapon that they made a series of astounding predictions, and so much that Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin in the late 1930s said in despair that the bomber will always get through. And it was almost as if assets at sea, navies, and assets on the ground, infantry, were going to be secondary or even irrelevant. The war would take place up in the air. The problem with that is nobody lives up in the air, nobody eats in the air, nobody can fly. We don't have wings. So what you're doing is transferring labor and capital from the ground up into the air, and there has to be a purpose for that. And the purpose had to be either air superiority or air supremacy. And by that I mean your air forces had to beat the other person's air forces for the prime reason that they could then direct their assets to where things really mattered on the ground, taking cities or territory, or killing people or capturing them on the ground. If you couldn't do that and you only achieved air parity, then both sides were sort of wasting their time in an irrelevant theater. So the purpose was to build more planes and train better pilots to destroy the enemy's air assets, or at least weaken them so you had air superiority. And then the holy grail was air supremacy. That meant that you could put your assets up in the air, they could fly over the enemy's territory, destroy his cities or his armies on the ground, and they would be invulnerable because you had destroyed the enemy's ability to fight back in the air. And that was pretty much the theory of air power in World War II. It's a great question today that we ponder, was it worth it? The people say it didn't work. It was 80,000 people weren't worth it. We lost over 5,000 bomber planes. We spent 40% of our military budget, and yet German industrial production kept going. The defenders of air power said, well, we had to make the necessary investments. We lost men and material learning how to fly in the proper formation, how to have the proper fighter, the proper fighter tactics, the proper radar. But once we learned that, we destroyed Germany's industrial production. And it's not quite accurate to say it continued to increase in terms of vehicle or aircraft production, because Germany really wasn't mobilized until Albert Speer, the czar of German industry, took control of the economy in late 1943. Once he did that, we were destroying the increase in production. And Speer's planned economy was not sustainable. So even though it increased, it did not increase at the rate that it would otherwise have had we not been bombing around the clock. The United States lost about 400,000 dead through accidents, disease, and combat. Britain lost a little bit fewer, and yet defeated a far more formidable enemy than was true in World War I. In other words, Germany, Japan, and Italy were far more powerful allies and enemies than had been the imperial German army of World War I. And how did they do that? And how did they lose only about 2 to 3% of their entire military forces? And the answer was sea power and air power did one thing. They avoided the need to land in Europe at the very beginning of 1940, 41 in the case of British, and the United States in 42 or 43 in Japan. In other words, we did not do what we did in 1917 in the case of America and the British in 1914. We did not bleed white our ground forces to take the enemy capital and knock the enemy out of the war. We bombed them into submission and therefore precluded an invasion of Japan entirely, and we precluded an invasion of Europe until we were ready to do it in June 1944. So the ultimate verdict, I think, on air power was it was very costly. It did not work too well in 41, 42, and 43, but the Allies gained the lessons and achieved air superiority and eventually air supremacy that by 1944, 1945, it saved thousands of lives, and it was one of the greatest successes of World War II.
Thank you for watching. We hope you're enjoying our highlight series and invite you to explore our complete course on the Second World Wars. All of Hillsdale College's online courses are free and for everyone who loves to learn.